Well, I was getting ready to go live here, and I was looking at checking updates and everything like that. And I knew he was already coming back, but I was like, man, I can't wait for Mike Evans to return. Guys, I've been talking about this for a few weeks now. What I've noticed over this entire year, and it just becomes more and more apparent every time that I sit and think about it, and I actually look into it. The wide receiver position in fantasy football has been screwing us all year long. This is not like last year, man. Last year was actually, pretty good for wide receivers in fantasy football. Like, if you actually just look at the wide receivers and the performances up to this point, it just hasn't been good enough. Like, obviously, we've got Jamar Chase, 19.6 fantasy points per game, 15.9 from Amon-Ra St. Brown, 15.2 from JJ. Like, those are our top three wide receivers right now in fantasy football. Last year, if you just look at the top opponents or the top wide receivers in fantasy football, like it's so drastically different. Like our top three last year, 19.7 fantasy points per game, 19.8, and 17 fantasy points per game. Like it's simply not been the same. It has simply not been the same, guys. So it's just really interesting, to kind of see all that what's actually taking place. And it's great to get Mike Evans back because Mike Evans, he's averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game. But I mean, that's, it's like I said, go down to the wide receiver 7, Terry. That's our wide receiver 7 averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game. So like we need Mike Evans back in the lineup. And luckily right now, looks like he is trending towards that direction. He's been limited in practice this week. He was limited today. So it's looking pretty good so far. So like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we're going to get into y'all's fantasy football questions tonight. And we're going to see what's going on here. William Barnes, what's going on? Hey, would you rather start Jonnu Smith or JT at flex this week? It's so crazy, because, this is not a far-fetched question. Like, before the year, if you would have asked me that question, it'd be like, what are you talking about, right? Like, it would make sense if we were talking about that before the year started. But, Jonathan Taylor last week, I said it on my running back rankings today. It's a problem with him because his opportunities at the goal line got taken last week by Anthony Richardson. Like, that's a real serious problem right now. So, if he can't average more than 2.4 yards per carry against the Jets, I've got serious concerns, man. Whereas Jonnu's role has become really consistent in Tennessee's offense. And I think that the matchup with New England is much better than the matchup with the Detroit Lions. Jonnu Smith consistently getting 6 to 8 targets since their bye week. It's tough, man. I'll be honest, though. I'm probably going to start Jonathan Taylor just because he gets more volume on a consistent basis than Jonnu. I get it. Jonnu has been better, and he was last week by a mile. But overall, the volume lies with Jonathan Taylor, and he is a player that can hit a big game. It's kind of reminding me, it kind of feels like Breece Hall for the past several weeks, right? With Breece Hall, everybody's been down on him. Well, then he comes out and he gets 30 points in a full PPR last week. It's when you have that kind of player, that's what he can do. So I just think that it's important to keep that in mind. Brian03, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Thoughts on Cade Otton rest of season PPR? I love this discussion because I came out with the tight end rankings, the rest of season tight end rankings on Monday, and I was talking about, listen, Cade Otton was my number 5 tight end. He was in the same tier, second tier, with David Njoku. And what I said about it was listen, Cade, they're in the same tier because I believe they both will continue to be great. I have more doubts about Otton than I do with Njoku. Because with Njoku, there's no Mike Evans coming back, right? Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, they've all been there. And Njoku has been the most consistent out of those options for Jameis Winston. He's going to consistently be getting you high-end weeks in fantasy. So I have more confidence with Njoku, but, with Cade Otton, I have a lot of confidence in him as well. Obviously, the last several weeks with Cade Otton have been fantastic because of no Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. But with Mike Evans coming back into the fold, it makes me question his ceiling. I don't see I don't see a world where he gets 10, 11 targets, for the rest of the season. Maybe 2 more times. I can see that happening. But, for me personally, I just think that his ceiling may drop a little bit. Now, is he going to be a bad tight end? No. I think he's going to be a really good tight end play the rest of the year. I think what we've been getting from him is we've been spoiled a little bit with, top 3 tight end production. I don't think we're going to be getting that any longer. There may be an outlier week here or there, but ultimately, I think what we'll see with Cade Otton for the rest of the year, with Mike Evans back into the fold, is that he'll become their number 2 target. And I think that he'll be a tight end 1 in fantasy still, but maybe instead of a top 3 tight end, he'll probably be like a top 6 to 7 tight end. And obviously, there's a big difference between the top 3 tight end averaging 10.2 fantasy points per game and one that's averaging, 9 or 7 fantasy points per game. That's my thoughts on him. Appreciate the super chat. That is how you get your question answered right away. To drop a super chat, you get to jump the line. Ryan Hode, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Njoku or Hockenson? Njoku all the way. Through and through. If it's this week, it's Njoku. If it's rest of season, it's Njoku. Look, I got a lot of flack for ranking Hockenson outside my top 17 when I did the video on Monday. And listen, it's not because I don't think Hockenson can become what he once was. Hockenson, what I've seen from him is just he doesn't look as capable athletically as he did last year before the injury, which is understandable. This guy's just barely recovering from a massive knee injury, right? Where is TJ Hockenson? Why am I missing him? There you go. TJ Hockenson, 5.9 fantasy points per game so far. And, 4 targets, 9 targets, 3 targets. I need to see more from him. And this week, the matchup versus Chicago, I don't love at all. Whereas Njoku, yes, on the surface, it doesn't sound like a great matchup. And Pittsburgh's been great this year defensively for sure. But, for me, it's not that. It doesn't worry about me. I just don't worry about that personally. So, yeah, I think that's how I feel about that is Njoku is just too important consistently. Whereas, this is your situation where it's Hockenson is not as important as Hockenson is. He's just not. He's simply not that important. So yeah, definitely an Njoku discussion for me. I would take an Njoku for sure. Appreciate the super chat. Okay, going back up to the top, we'll just go from top to bottom. Sergio Vivar, what's the word on Nabers? Might trade for him, but not sure what kind of value I should go for. Well, I've been kind of on Malik Nabers' case for several weeks now at this point. Here's the hard truth about Malik Nabers. So, obviously, I want to break it down into how he's performed this year. So, let's go first month of the season, weeks 1 through 4. Weeks 1 through 4 for Malik Nabers, he was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy, only behind Nico Collins, averaging 18.5 fantasy points per game. Now, since week 5, let's go from week 5 to week 11. Let's look at that. Malik Nabers is nowhere to be found inside of the top 24. Not only that, he's nowhere to be found inside the top 36. Malik Nabers, over that stretch, has been dude, I don't know if people are going to believe this. Since week 5, from Malik Nabers, weeks 5 through 11, Malik Nabers is the wide receiver 71 in fantasy football. That's insane. When you put it in that category, when you put it in that context, Malik Nabers, is not, I'm not trading for Malik Nabers as a wide receiver. I would not be sending, wide receiver 1 value for Malik Nabers right now. There's not a chance. Now, obviously, with Malik Nabers, he missed a couple games during this time. It's also important to keep that in mind. He's only played 4 games. But, he's averaging 8.7 fantasy points per game. And the target share is there, but the effectiveness is not. Now, how does that all change, obviously, with Tommy Cutlets? I like to call Tommy Cutlets. That's Tom DiNucci, So, how it changes is like maybe he does end up providing Malik more upside. It's very possible. It's also very possible it's about the same or worse, right? Either way, that's like wide receiver 2 production there. So for me personally, like Malik Nabers established himself so early. I think people are holding on to that. If you can get Malik Nabers for like, I would probably take the shot on him over Calvin Ridley. I'd probably take the shot on him over a Jameson Williams. I'd take the shot on him over a guy like, Rashad White maybe at the running back position. But the point being, like, low-end wide receiver 2s / low-end RB2s is what I would personally not send more for. You know what I mean? Like, you just kind of, you got to have to look at reality on this one and just address the fact that he is just not the same player as he was in fantasy the first month of the season. So if you trade for him, proceed with caution on this one. Ando, hey, what's going on? Half PPR, 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, and a flex. T. Hill, I'm assuming, is Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, Puka Nacua, Mike Evans, Jaden Reed, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, and James Conner. Drake London on bye. At wide receiver, I would personally be going with Puka and Evans this week. At running back, I would go Saquon, and I would go with Josh Jacobs. And then at flex, I would go with Tyreek over Jaden and James Conner. That's personally what I would end up doing right there. I think that because Tyreek is not by any means must start for me still. Like, Tyreek was better last week. I think he had his best fantasy game since week 1 last week, which is it's a good sign. But I don't feel confident that we're like out of the woods yet with Tyreek Hill, right? Tyreek Hill is still definitely not like, I still don't feel great about Tyreek Hill. I do not. So it needs to be the right situation. I think for me, Jaden Reed has been so mid lately, and it's disappointing because I love him. And with James Conner, I don't particularly love the matchup too much. So I think that's what I would end up doing. Trigger Trey, what's going on? Full PPR, 6-point passing touchdowns. Bo Nix or Herbert, Otton or Hockenson, and need a running back 2, wide receiver 2, and a flex out of Tyrone Tracy, JT, DJ Moore, Jennings, and McConkey this week. So I would go, man, I'll tell you what, like Bo Nix and Herbert I think are great plays this week. I prefer Herbert, and I'll tell you the reasons why. So someone pointed this out to me, and I actually do think it's a really good point. Although I don't think it's going to happen, it did give me enough doubt. Just kind of rethinking about this one. With a guy like Bo this week, he's taking on the Raiders. And the Raiders are bad. Like, I've danced on them so much this year ever since I felt slighted. I felt really slighted by them because their defense stinks. The reality is that they do get up to play for divisional opponents. Like, that is the reality, and it's true. So it gave me just enough doubt to make it a clear Herbert for me, because I think this game could easily be a shootout. It could easily become a slugfest a little bit because it's a Harbaugh Bowl. And it could be kind of like it was last week for the Ravens. But ultimately, I think that Herbert, that team is going to struggle to run. The Chargers, I think, will struggle to run. And I think that it could be another big Herbert game. So I'm going to go with Herbert. At tight end, I'd go Otton. I like the matchup versus the Giants. And like I said, I just think that Otton is more important to the offense right now than TJ Hockenson is. RB2, wide receiver 2, and a flex. I'm personally playing Tyrone Tracy over JT this week. I'm totally fine doing that. I think Tyrone Tracy is a good matchup versus Tampa Bay, and he will handle tons of work, whereas JT has a bad matchup. And the problem, again, as I said, is if he doesn't get the goal line carries, like, it's a problem. It's a real problem for him. So I'd go, Tracy's my RB2. I would go with Jennings as my wide receiver 2 for sure. And I would go with Ladd as my... I'd go with Ladd as my flex to stack him with Justin Herbert. Close between him and Jonathan Taylor, but personally, I think it's a better idea to just go with the stack. Because like I said, I think this game could easily turn into a shootout. And the Ravens are just so... They're so deficient when it comes to covering wide receivers. They cannot. Like, all year it's been like this. It's not gotten better. Like, every game this year, they've been plastered by wide receivers in fantasy. So I think there's another good opportunity for Ladd this week. Dustin Stone, Downs, QJ, or Watson, have PPR. So I answered a question like this actually on the video I did today. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch it after the live stream. Must start and sit is what I do every single week, and it basically goes through the guys who are more flexible and more fringe type of players and guys that I just ultimately have tons of conviction on. Well, QJ, Quentin Johnston, was in there. I love Quentin Johnston this week. I think the matchup, as I just got done saying with Ladd, is fantastic. It's a fantastic matchup for fantasy football purposes. However, the problem is that ultimately he's still not like Josh Downs is clearly and consistently the wide receiver one. Regardless of who the quarterback is, he's getting the most targets on a per game basis than any other option in Indianapolis. Doesn't matter if Michael Pittman's fully healthy or not. Josh Downs has been the best wide receivers by far. And last week it ended up working out. Listen, I don't love the matchup versus Detroit. They're going to get smothered, I think. But ultimately, I'm just going to go with targets on this one because I think that Indy will be in a hole and Josh Downs will be important. So I'm going to go with Josh Downs over Quentin Johnston. And Watson, honestly, I think Watson is kind of a sneaky good play this week as well against San Francisco. But it's very similar. Like, he's in the same class. Like, to me, there's a couple wide receivers in the same class. There's Jamison Williams, there's Christian Watson, and then there's Quentin Johnston. And I think that all those wide receivers, and you could have thrown Rashid Shaheed into that mix before he got injured as well. But the point being with those three guys is they're all big play threats that don't see much volume on a weekly basis, and it's not consistent enough. So you can't look at them as weekly plug and play starts, right? Matchup comes into consideration, and sometimes you just kind of got to get lucky. So I'm not going to play either Johnson or Watson. I'll play Downs, who's the more consistent target guy. Omar's Burner, what's going on? Any concern starting Puka with how Quinyon Mitchell has been locking down wide receivers? You know, it's actually a good point out that you just made. Because a massive reason why the Eagles defense and that secondary has developed so much over the last, month and a half is because their secondaries, their young players are coming through, man. Like Vic Fangio, that coordinator, he's been a long-time NFL great. Started out rocky, but it's coming through now. And Quinyon Mitchell has done really well. However, Quinyon's still a rookie, and I think Puka is just too good to sit. Because with Puka Nacua, if you just look at Puka, his involvement on a per-week basis, it's just too much to ignore, man. Puka, since he came back, 9 targets, 4 targets, 14 targets, 9 targets. And the only reason he had 4 targets against Seattle is because he got thrown out of the game early. For something really stupid, by the way, but these are minor details. You can't ignore that kind of production. Every game, except the game he got thrown out, he's had basically 100 yards receiving. And that was also, he took on Minnesota's defense, who not particularly strong against the wide receiver position, I guess. But I see your point with Quinyon Mitchell is the point I'm trying to make. However, it's just not anyone that I would consider to be a benchable player this week. I personally just don't see that. The way that Stafford, Kupp, and Puka are playing, it's scary, man. And I say this, here's one thing that's also important to remember about this matchup in particular, is that I believe personally that the Rams are fighting. Well, this isn't just a belief, it's a fact. The Rams are fighting for their playoff lives right now. So you have to take that into account right? Like, they're going to come out swinging, and it's Sunday Night Football. They're going to come out swinging. I can guarantee you that. So, yeah, for me, I can't go against Puka in any situation. None at all. Angel Coronado, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Picked up Kraft, and when Ingram was injured, can't stand playing either of them. I don't blame you. Pick up Henry, Sanders, or just roll with what I got. Thanks, brother. Appreciate you being in here tonight. Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, obviously, Kraft just put up a goose egg last week, and it's capable. Like, that's the one thing I've been warning about with Tucker Kraft this year is that if you look at his game, like his game log, his volume weekly has been really low. Like, it's not good enough to consistently just throw out there and trust that he's going to hit the big play, because that's exactly what you have to do when you're getting 5 targets, 4 targets, maybe a 6-target game. 9 targets was an outlier. You know, like, so he gets 1 target last week, and he played 93% of the snaps. Like, that's scary. And on the other hand, Ingram's upside is so low. Like, for me personally, I don't have a problem with you dropping Ingram and picking up Henry. Henry in particular makes a lot of sense. Because Hunter Henry, I've been pointing this out. First of all, he's the tight end 12 right now, and it's just gotten better for him ever since Drake May. And if you remember, Drake May's first game was against Houston in week 6. 11.6, 13.2, 7, 9.1, 1.9, 9.3. Well, unlike Tucker Kraft, the outlier here is 4 targets. And everything else, 9 targets, 6 targets, 8 targets, 9 targets. Like, he's consistently a top option for Drake May. So it's just way better to trust a guy like Kraft. And at the same time, Ingram gets volume, but it's all low upside. Like, he can't move even as well as Hunter Henry can, and his quarterback play is not as good. So to me, like, Hunter Henry is the better option moving forward than Evan Ingram is. So, like, I don't have a problem with dropping Ingram immediately, today, tonight, and just rolling out with Hunter Henry for the future. Like, I think that's a fine play. Some weeks I may suggest to play Tucker Kraft because it depends on, you know, it ultimately would depend on matchup, because he does obviously, as we just pointed out, have a big upside to hit boom games, whereas Henry, we haven't really seen that too much this year. But to me, like, I would make that move immediately. And the one thing I'll say is I don't prefer Fant, but with Jatavian Sanders, I will say keep an eye on Jatavian Sanders. And the reason you don't have to pick him up right now is because nobody's thinking about him. He plays for the Panthers. He hasn't done very well. Like, he hasn't been that involved this year. But, like, if you look back to week 5, you know, since week 5, 5 targets, 7 targets, 6 targets, 1 target, 5 targets, 2 targets. Like, he has been getting more involved in this offense. Like, his snap count percentage has been pretty high with the exception of week 8. So, I will say keep an eye on Jatavian Sanders, but ultimately I'm just going to go ahead and pick up Hunter Henry because that gives you immediate production. Appreciate the super chat. Hey, Zerb, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Bo Nix or Jaden Daniels? Smith or Quentin Johnston PPR? So, again, Bo and Jaden are really close this week. And, again, I'm going to end up picking Jaden this week because with Jaden, the matchup versus the Cowboys it's fantastic. Like, I love this matchup. And I'll say this, like, the one side note I'll make on the Cowboys defense is actually, like, their defense with all those pieces back against the Texans looked much better. Like, they held the Texans in check for a decent part of that game. But the ultimate problem with that is it's like the Giants, right? Like, the Giants can't put up points, and they can't sustain drives. So what happens to their defense? Well, they're exhausted by the fourth quarter because they've been on the field for the majority of the game. They're never winning time of possession. So their defense is out there for hours, right? So it just makes more sense for me to play Jaden, even though he's coming off a down week. But that was Philly's defense. Like, he's going up against Dallas's defense. It's just a different situation, man. It's so much different. So, for me personally, yeah, I think Philly makes a ton. Like, I think Jaden makes too much sense this week, and I'm a little nervous still about. I'm still a little nervous about Bo with the Raiders. That is one thing that was pointed out to me today, and I think it's very valid. And then with Devonta Smith or Quentin Johnston, I think that, again, it just comes down to Quentin Johnston is not like a must start in the traditional sense of like you need to play him over like 95% of options. Like, no, I'm not saying that. Like, he's a must start for like people who are in like more dire situations. Devonta Smith, like I would play him for sure. Because Devonta Smith this week, the matchup I think is going to be really high scoring. Honestly, I think this one's going to be a high scoring matchup. Because again, the Rams are fighting for their playoff lives. And the Eagles can put up points, obviously. So I think that personally it will be a bit of a high scoring game. I think Devonta Smith will rebound and in this type of game script have a big performance and have more volume. So I'll personally stick with Devonta Smith in this game. Appreciate the super chat. Nate Dogg, what's going on, my man? Appreciate the super chat. Pick a tight end and 2 flex. Disley, Hunter, Dobbs, Lockett, Amir Abdullah be a sneaky good play. Pick a tight end and 2 flex, 2 wide receivers. McBride and Njoku, QJ, McConkey, Reed, JSN, Flowers. Do I start Hubbard or Williams? Okay. So pick a tight end and 2 flex. Disley, Hunter. Yeah, I've gotten a lot of flack also for not having Will Disley inside of the top 17 moving forward. Listen, it's not... I've got nothing against Will Disley, but the majority of this year, like, it's not been that good, right? Like, it's not like he's been uninvolved or anything like that. Like, he's clearly the number 1 tight end over there. It's just like, there's games, like, a lot of these games are just, like, low floor games. So... Hunter Henry, it just makes too much sense, right? Like, Hunter Henry just simply is more involved on a weekly basis. Disley's not uninvolved, but, like, Henry's involvement is more so, and he's just shown more of a higher floor over the, last, like, month and a half than Will Disley. I get it. The matchup is good for Disley theoretically, but I'm going to stick with Hunter Henry on this one because I just think that matchup is also good in Miami, right? Like, it's not that he doesn't have a good matchup. If we were talking about, like, Detroit versus New England, yeah, I'd probably lean Disley because, Detroit will smother anybody, right? But, like, the Dolphins aren't going to smother the Patriots. They're going to be able to throw on them. So I'm going to go with Hunter Henry at the tight end spot. Your flexes, Dobbs, Lockett, Amir Abdullah. So Amir Abdullah, listen, obviously Alexander Madison and Zamir White are issues. The Broncos are not the Broncos are too good personally. Like, the Broncos are just simply in a position to where I really can't trust that they're going to be able to give up points to the running back position. The Raiders are atrocious running the ball. It's really, really bad. So I can't endorse that one, to be honest with you. Their defense has been too good against running backs and everything, really. And then simultaneously, you've got a team that can't run the ball. And Amir Abdullah is not like a particularly great running back. So for me personally, I would go ahead and play Dobbs. Because Dobbs, like, the thing about Dobbs is that the matchup last week versus Chicago was obviously tough. This matchup versus San Francisco is beatable. And Romeo Dobbs, like, although he's a boomer bust guy, kind of like everybody is in Green Bay. But the one thing is that, like, he's mostly, like, one of their top targets on a weekly basis. Like, last week obviously wasn't good, but the majority of the time he's in on, 80% of snaps, and, he's getting targeted, like, anywhere between 5 to 10 times per game. So I think that he's still the better play between him and Lockett, because Lockett at this point I think is taking a clear and definitive role as the number 3 wide receiver, and Cardinals defense is a little bit tougher. So I'd go Hunter and Lockett, or Hunter and Dobbs. Tight end and 2 flex and 2 wide receivers. McBride and Njoku, they're both great, obviously. I mean, we might end up flexing one of them. I probably end up playing McBride because McBride, man, like I pointed this out on the rest of the season tight end rankings. With Trey McBride, he's a top 3 tight end in fantasy, and the dude's only scored 1 touchdown this year. And it wasn't even through the air, it was on the ground. Like, this guy has been that good in fantasy every week without getting in the end zone. One of these days, it's going to happen. Like, one of these days, he's going to get in the end zone. And it's going to be awesome. I love Njoku, but, like, McBride is just, man, like, he is. That dude, all he needs to do is get in the end zone. And he's going to be lighting up fantasy scoreboards. I'm sticking with McBride. Wide receivers, I'd go with JSN and Flowers this week because JSN, the matchup versus Arizona, I did just say, like, Arizona's defense is tough. Well, the reality is that, like, their defense is actually beatable through the air. Like, that's the one place they've been susceptible at because, like, outside of Buda Baker, like, that defense really doesn't have tons of talent. It's not that they're bad, obviously. It's just that they don't have tons of talent. They're not stacked with it. And ultimately, I just think that JSN's in good position to have a pretty good game again. And again, he's clearly getting, his role of getting like 8 to 10 targets per game. I think that's kind of what we can expect moving forward. Flowers, again, I think that this matchup versus the Chargers, I think there's going to be a lot of throwing. I do, because both defenses are good against the run, and they both have great quarterbacks who are they're going to throw the ball this week. I think Zay is in line for a potentially really big week. Man, Njoku, QJ, Ladd, or Jaden Reed, they're all great options. I think I'm going to end up going with Ladd this week. Again, the matchup is just too good. It sucks to leave Njoku and a lot of those guys on your bench, but to me, the matchup versus Baltimore, like, they're dead last versus wide receivers, and they have been all year. They've been atrocious. It's actually, like, insane to watch how bad the Ravens are versus wide receivers. It's insane to watch. So I think Ladd just has too good of an opportunity to sit him this week. And then Hubbard or Williams. Well, I'm assuming you're talking about Javonte Williams. Listen, there's no way I can trust the Broncos running back. Those Broncos running backs are so tricky because, hey, listen, I like Sean Payton a lot. Like, Sean Payton is a really good coach, and he's, resurrected the Broncos completely. But at the same time, like, he sucks for fantasy football. Like, we can't rely on that dude with running backs because there's no transparency there with running back position. So ultimately, like, I have my concerns with Chuba, which I laid out this week, but ultimately it's not a Jonathan Brooks concern. It's a matchup concern. I hate the matchup versus Kansas City, but ultimately I can't trust Javonte. I can't trust any of them. So I'd rather just play the guy I know I can trust, which is Chuba Hubbard, and Chuba's just been so good this year, maybe he finds his way into the end zone. Appreciate the super chat, Nate Dogg. Always good to talk to you. Adam Thompson, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Do you really think Tillman is a hold considering his schedule and now the headache of guessing which wide receiver will go off week to week? So here's the thing. I'm going to address the second part of your question first. I can understand why, like, it's more of a, like, pressing decision this week because obviously Jerry Jeudy just went nuclear. It's not like Jerry Jeudy just had like a 15-point game. No, Jerry Jeudy went freaking nuts in fantasy. In a half PPR format, he had 23.2 fantasy points and 150 yards practically and a touchdown on 6 catches. And the one thing I'll say is, like, with Jameis, I've been talking up Cedric Tillman quite a bit. Well, Jerry Jeudy's had 6 targets, 8 targets, 11 targets, 11 targets. Let me tell you this. Here's why I'm ultimately not that concerned about this one. I've been saying this for years. And in the beginning, I used to get, like, a ton of flack for calling this one out how it is. Jerry Jeudy, dude, there's a reason. This stuff means a lot to me personally. When you hear former players talk about current players, that rhetoric's important. Because former players like Steve Smith, who is a Hall of Fame wide receiver, and, several other former players that I can't remember who the names are, but they came out, against Jerry Jeudy last year and the year before, and they were like, this guy doesn't care about football. He's so low effort. And I think they're right. I see the same thing on film. It's just that I don't have as much credibility as they do. But to hear them say it, it's like, that's a problem, man. So Jerry Jeudy, there's a reason why, outside of that game, a lot of production this year has just been very spotty and inconsistent. Listen, I get it with Cedric. Cedric, 3 out of the 4 games with Jameis, excellent in fantasy. Excellent. And it's not like he just, fell out of favor last week. He had 8 targets in that game. And I get it. The matchups, moving forward, he's got some stinkers in there. He's got Pittsburgh twice in the next 3 weeks. Denver gets Pat Surtain potentially. Kansas City, Cincinnati, Miami. Ultimately, I still believe he's worth rostering. However, what I'll say is that it kind of reminds me of DeAndre Hopkins. Somebody asked me a question about D-Hop earlier today. Can I drop D-Hop? Someone was asking me. And I said, listen, I'm not dropping D-Hop for no reason, right? If I'm dropping a player like DeAndre Hopkins, there's got to be someone on the waiver wire that I really want. At this point in the year, I can't think of anyone right now off the top of my head who I think is going to be potentially better upside than Cedric. Unless you're in a shallower league where you have a Quentin Johnston out there. Maybe you have a Jameson Williams out there. Maybe you have somebody like a Rashad Bateman out there. Or I might not even do it for Rashad Bateman. Maybe you have a Jacoby Myers out there. Maybe you have somebody like that, right? Like a Keon Coleman. Unless we're talking about those types of guys, yeah, I'd probably hold on to him. If we get into the range of Andre Yeshivas, Demario Douglas, Roma Dunze, Jordan Addison, I think I'd prefer Cedric Tillman still, personally. It just ultimately comes down to, do not forget the volume was there last week. That's the one thing I'll say. Appreciate the super chat. All right, next up we have Dino Bekurovic. Vic. I probably just butchered her name. Sorry, I appreciate the super chat. Quarterback start, AR or Geno? Tight end, Henry or Andrews? Yeah, for me personally, I think Anthony Richardson's a bench this week. I just can't. Listen, I've said it all week. Anthony Richardson played his best football game as a pro last week against the New York Jets. Well, you know what? It was the freaking New York Jets. That's a big deal. That's a big deal to take on the Jets and do that. If you're talking about if he comes out and he does this very similar thing against Detroit, then I'll be really interested. But to me, it's not like you're debating Anthony Richardson or Cooper Rush. If you were talking about that, I'd say Anthony Richardson. But you're talking about Geno, who has been really good in fantasy. Geno is a guy that, yes, can give you stinkers, but also can give you 25-point ceilings. His matchup is not great either, but he's just a more functional quarterback on a regular basis than Anthony Richardson is. So for me personally, yeah, I've got to go with Geno this week. I just think that it's still just too risky for me to take Anthony Richardson at this point in the season over somebody who's more consistent like Geno. And again, I'm not saying Geno's consistent. He's more consistent than Anthony Richardson is, though. Henry or Andrews? Good question. Andrews has been really one that I've struggled with, too. Because, I've kind of been, wanting to move him back up my rankings. Because he's Mark Andrews, and he's done well since the since the month of September. You got him out of the months of September. Week 5, starting week 5. 7.5 fantasy points, 14.1, 18.1, 12.1, 3.6, 15.8, and 3.2. But like the biggest deal is that like he's been involved, pretty consistently. Now, he's still not getting the same amount of volume he used to, and Henry is getting basically that amount of volume as well, and his floor is a lot safer, but his ceiling's not quite as high. The matchup against Miami this week is good, but ultimately, it's kind of like I've been saying the whole time tonight, which is this matchup, the Ravens and Chargers, ultimately I think is going to be potentially high scoring. And it's close, man, because the Chargers are good against tight ends this year. I think it's going to be a really high scoring game. I'll go with Henry because of matchup, I guess. Henry's matchup makes more sense, but Andrews is not that far behind. Like, honestly, depending on how you feel about it, like if you have a tendency to lean one way or the other on this one, I would say go with your gut, because they're still pretty close to me in my rankings this week. So I would go with Henry just slightly, but that's honestly a toss-up a little bit. Appreciate the super chat. Ismail, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Herbert or Mahomes, Laporta or Disley moving forward? Yeah, I went through the rest of season quarterback rankings on Monday and the rest of season side of rankings as well. I prefer Herbert over Mahomes. Listen, it sounds weird to say it, but like it's just time that people like address reality on this one and acknowledge that like Mahomes is just kind of a big name in fantasy at this point. Like, he's not done enough to make him like immune from going a different direction. Like, Mahomes is obviously the best quarterback in real life. That's why I feel so weird. But like, he's giving you good performances, but nothing that's like standing out besides week 9 versus Tampa Bay. Depending on your scoring format, maybe you got one more 20-point game from him versus the Las Vegas Raiders. But, like, he's the quarterback 13 right now in the season for a reason. Like, he's been solid every week. He's never going to lose you a game. But at the same time, like, you're just not getting that upside that you could get with a Herbert. Like, Herbert, the reality is, like, yeah, like, numbers-wise, Justin Herbert's still, like, losing to him. But, like, his last month, he's been tossing the ball a lot more, and they've been relying on him more. And again, I think this matchup, the Ravens are going to really make it hard for the Chargers to play their brand of football. Like, if you actually looked at it last week, J.K. Dobbins struggled quite a bit in the first half versus the Bengals. And then they had to throw to keep up because the Bengals were putting up points like crazy. If this matchup becomes that, Herbert's going to have to keep up and keep them in games, and he can. And the Ravens secondary sucks. So me personally, like, this week I definitely prefer Herbert. Moving forward, I also prefer him as well, because I just think that with Herbert, he's got beatable matchups, and I just simply think that he's just got a higher ceiling at this point. I think he does. So I prefer Herbert over Mahomes moving forward. Laporta or Disley, I got a lot of flack for this too. I got quite a bit of flack on my tight end ranking video. I thought it was great. Yeah, I love hearing the feedback. It's awesome. To be honest, like, here's the reason I like Laporta still, is because he does play for the Lions. Like, the Lions do offer him still a good amount of upside depending on the week. Like, he still can give you like 15, 13, 14-point games, but obviously I won't deny the problem, which is that he's been receiving less targets this year than he did last year. And even last year, he was still kind of touchdown dependent. Will Disley he's just not the level of player. And, like, his ceiling hasn't really been higher than Laporta's, even on more work, right? So, like, I just don't see, how people really... honestly, I don't see how people prefer Disley over him. I really don't. Like, Disley's getting more volume, but it's not like he's doing much better with it, you know? He only has 1 touchdown in the year, and he's getting, just... he's not athletic enough to, like, make much happen with it. Laporta can still move because he's young, and he moves after the catch. So I prefer Laporta still. I prefer Laporta, and I prefer Justin Herbert. Appreciate the super chat. Nate Dogg, appreciate the super chat. Can I drop Lockett for Ricky Pearsall or Kayshawn? I see your message down there. I think that Lockett is definitely droppable as well. Let's look at his volume and his snap count percentage over the week, but I definitely feel like he's more droppable. Lockett, yeah, his last 3 games, 3 targets, 4 targets, 3 targets. He's still in on like 70% of the snaps usually, but at the same time, like, it's not really worth that much because of the fact that he's just being overtaken. Like, it's DK and JSN. It's happened. The transition has happened. Took a little longer than some may have thought, but it has happened. But at the same time, like, Ricky this week, obviously goose-egged, disappointed a lot of people out there. I still think that Ricky is I still think that Ricky is a playable option moving forward. But I will say that his volume is not much different from Tyler Lockett's. He's just a more explosive player, obviously, at this point. I'd probably take the shot on Ricky. Kayshon Boutte, I was talking about him for quite a while. Let's see what his volume's been like. I'll be honest, like, he's kind of left my thoughts over the recent weeks. 4 straight games with 6 targets. Volume's not gone anywhere. He just hasn't really done too much with it. He's got some really good upcoming matchups, too. Here's what I would do. Personally, if this was me, the way I know my leagues is nobody's thinking about Kayshon Boutte except me, because I'm a nut job. Dude, I'm a fantasy football crazy person, and I never stop thinking about it. So, like, I know I'm the only one in my league thinking, and any of my leagues that's thinking about Kayshon Boutte. I would personally rather pick up Ricky, take the shot on him for the next week or 2. I'm fine with dropping Lockett today. Drop Lockett today, pick up Ricky. The only way I would say prioritize Kayshon over Ricky is if you know somebody that is ready to pick him up too. Like, they've got their eye on him as well, and they're watching for him too. That's the only way I can really see myself prioritizing Kayshon Boutte over Ricky Pearsall. Because just, what I've seen is nobody's looking at him in my own personal leagues. So I would personally drop Lockett for Ricky and then see how Ricky develops and keep an eye on Kayshon too and be ready to drop Ricky at the drop of a hat for Kayshon if he starts to perform. Appreciate the super chat. Adam Thompson, appreciate the super chat. Drop estimate for Akers. Might be overthinking it, but I need the win this week. Akers looks more involved in the offense. Plus, the Bears have had bad run defense. Yeah, honestly, here's my thoughts. Like, honestly, the only reason that I had estimate ranked higher this week than Cam Akers is because of the potential of the matchup and the potential that, like I said earlier, this running back carousel in Denver is so hard to follow. Like, it's been the hardest backfield to crack this year by far. Dallas is maybe second, but, like, they've been relatively easy since they just decided Zeke is his age and we need to just go with Rico Dowdle. But, like, the only reason I put him there higher than Cam Akers is because of that. Honestly, in reality, though, I would play Cam Akers over Dowdle. Or, I'm sorry, over Estimate. Because the matchup, I don't personally think it's as good as the Raiders is. Divisional matchup, and the Bears are still fighting for something. The Raiders are literally not playing for much. And I just think it, with Cam Akers, what I saw last week, with him being basically almost splitting touches with Aaron Jones, it tells me a couple things. Number one, Aaron Jones isn't fully healthy. He's not, and I don't think that changes this week. This guy, it's been the same problem for the past 3 years now with Aaron Jones. He can't stay healthy, and he's older, so as the season goes on, he wears down. Cam Akers just got there, and he's been sparingly used all year, both with Houston and with Minnesota. So, Cam Akers does make a lot of sense to play this week. If you're in that situation between him and Estime, honestly, I'd do the same thing, and I'd play Akers as well. Appreciate the super chat. Akers over Estime, and then the Argonite 1234. Appreciate the super chat. Tight end Goddard or Henry? Wide receiver Odunze or Wandale? Thanks. Yeah, obviously I made Goddard a must-start tight end for me this week. I still really like playing Goddard because, again, Goddard, his reality this year is actually pretty solid. Dallas Goedert, again, 8.6 fantasy points per game. Only the tight end 20 because he's only played 7 games. But he's 8th in tight end fantasy points per game. And his involvement's been pretty solid on a weekly basis. And he's actually a pretty athletic player. Again, he doesn't really have a massive ceiling. The matchup's really good. But I will say with Hunter Henry's just been more consistently involved, obviously. So I like his involvement more so than I like Dallas Goedert's involvement. And I think his matchup is probably just as good. I would end up going with Hunter Henry here. I just think it makes more sense to play a guy like that because he has I think it's just a more solid floor with also probably around the same level of upside as Dallas Goedert does. I highlighted him today mainly because he just kind of is in this gray area. I think people are kind of recognizing and understanding that Henry's actually a pretty good play. I think people are just recognizing that. So I highlighted Goddard today because he's been kind of in this gray area. Odunze or Wandale? I'm actually playing Wandale. I think Wandale is actually kind of a low-key good play this week. Matchup versus Tampa is excellent. And with Tommy Cutlett's, if last year's any indication, this guy can't push the ball down the field that much. There's going to be tons of, near the line of scrimmage, maybe a little downfield plays to Wandale. I think Wandale will have a big role this week. I think Wandale is a really good play. Whereas with the Odunze, it's hit or miss. That guy, with Caleb this year, it's been a mess. I mean, it's been a total mess in Chicago. Stinks, but that's the reality. I think Wandale is actually a solid play this week. I'd go with Wandale, and I would go with Henry. Appreciate the super chat. All right, up next we had Dino. What's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Deeper flex. Thielen, Elijah Moore, Keyshawn Boutte, or Westbrook Akine. Ooh, man. This is a good one. This is a fun one. Thielen playing the Chiefs is not fun in his first game back. I don't love that. Although the volume is going to be there because Leggett is not a volume guy right now. Coker is not that good. So volume should be there. Elijah Moore against the Steelers, there's potential in the slot. They've been more susceptible to slot receivers than outside receivers because Joey Porter Jr. has really kind of developed into a little bit of a shutdown corner as well. I would say Quinyon Mitchell, Joey Porter Jr., and obviously Pat Surtain, they've been 3 of my top 5 lockdown corners this year. So, Keyshawn versus Miami is actually a low-key good matchup because he's not going to be taking on Ramsey. That's what Demario Douglas is going to be facing most of the time. And then Westbrook Akine versus Houston, I'd rather just not take the shot. I mean, listen, Westbrook-Akine, I get it. He had a good week and he had the big play. But the consistent, like the involvement is not consistent enough for me. And also, he's just not he's not that good of a player. Now I get it. I will say this, watch out for him, but he's not been that good of a player throughout his career, and at the same time, he's dealing with Will Levis still. It's just not good enough. You know what I'm saying? So I'm leaning going with Thielen here. I'm going to go ahead and go with Thielen. Because the Chiefs also do have a major injury at corner this week. I'll pull it up for you guys. Just a depth chart because I'll talk about it. So they have Jalen Watson, who's out right now. And that's a big problem for them. They've had to reshift their corners around because Jalen Watson, very good player, lockdown corner, is out. So they had to reshift a lot of things around. I get it, McDuffie's really good this year, but they're going to have more trouble, handling a lot of these receivers that they're going to take on. So, yeah, I think for me personally, I think that I'd go with Thielen here. For volume purposes and for potential weaknesses and matchup purposes, even though the matchup is statistically very, very strong. Appreciate the super chat. Richard Cranium, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Need 2 wide receivers and a flex. Tyreek Hill, Debo, Jaden Reed, Moore, Eckler, Roschon, Trey Benson. Trust is low with these wide receivers anymore. Appreciate it as always. Yeah, I just got done saying at the beginning of the live stream, it's going to be something I cover deep into the offseason. The wide receiver production this year has been so night and day worse than it was last year. The only guy who's really been, living up to last year's expectations is Jamar Chase. That's it. Our top 5 receivers in fantasy this year, 2 of them, one of them is averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game. It's just not good enough. So I get it. Yeah, I'd go with Tyreek and Jaden Reed personally. Because I said this with Debo earlier. Debo is not only not the wide receiver 1 anymore. He's obviously gets his role in a different way. Honestly, though, he just doesn't look like the same player right now. He is definitely not healthy. He's not healthy. It's been a lost season for him. He's just kind of been unhealthy all year, and it hasn't got better, and Juwan Jennings is the better option in San Fran at this point. So he's by no means a lock must start. Obviously, Jaden's not either, but Jaden, I'd rather just take the shot on a player I know is more explosive at this point. Jaden still looks explosive, and he can make a big play. Debo, I'm not really sure he can right now. I know he can, but right now, it's just not there. So I'd go with Tyreek and Jaden. And at the flex, I guess I'd have to go with Debo. And I get it, like you were saying, trust is low with the wide receivers. I agree. But at the same time, unless you have a gut feeling on any of these running backs, I can't say that I trust any of these running backs any more than wide receivers, right? Roschon is still rotational and taking on a really tough matchup versus Minnesota this week. Trey Benson's still rotational. And Eckler at this point is rotational as well, right? All these wide receivers at least are in on 80% of the snaps, right? So you can count on the volume being there. All these other running backs are just rotational. There's not really a running back that you name that I can trust over one of those other wide receivers because they're just not getting the volume. I'll say this, keep an eye on Roschon this week and keep an eye on Benson because Benson's emerging and he's the future at running back. So maybe they just continue to get him more involved and kind of put James Conner more in the rear view. I doubt that'll happen, but just see what happens. And Roschon, just without Shane Waldron, I'm curious to see how this running back field goes. Like, do they start to genuinely split time between DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson? Like, I think it's possible. Roschon's been effective this year. But right now, I'd still say I don't trust either of them. I'd go Debo in the flex. Appreciate the super chat. Nate Dogg, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Drop Williams for Charbonnet just for a stash. Since I'll play Hubbard, drop Kansas City defense for Miami or Tampa. Big take, but Williams could prove us wrong. Javonte for Charbonnet. No, I personally wouldn't. I'll tell you why. Like, I feel the very same way you do, where it's like Javonte could easily be the running back moving forward. Like, it's so hard to tell with Sean Payton, like, what he's doing. But, like, there's one thing's for sure. The only guy who's actually put up, like, really good games for the Broncos this year is Javonte. Like, Jaleel McLaughlin hasn't done that. Audric Esme, even that one game people were freaking out about last week, Audric Esme averaged, like, 3.5 yards per carry. Like, the best running back, by far, actually, has been Javonte in this offense. The problem with Javonte is Peyton's crazy. We don't know how he's going to use these running backs on a weekly basis. And I think he likes it that way. I think he likes to keep defenses on their toes. So it's hard to, like, know when to play him, but at the same time, I'm with you. Like, I'm not dropping Javonte for somebody like Zach Charbonnet. I'm just not doing it. Because Zach Charbonnet, we know his role. Like, Zach Charbonnet's role is nothing more than, like, 5 touches per game, basically. Like, you don't get 10 touches per game out of him. You can with Javonte. So, I'm totally with you. I'm not dropping Javonte. Since you're playing Chuba, drop Kansas City for Miami or Tampa. Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. I would prefer to go with Tampa if you did, just because I think their matchup is really strong against the Giants. Miami's is too, but they've both been really bad defenses. I just think that with Kansas City, like I said this in the rankings video, and I haven't seen a ton of pushback on this one, and I'm actually kind of shocked because they're playing the Panthers. But the Chiefs defense, like, I've tried to say this a lot, like, this is a great real-life defense, a bad fantasy defense. They're the defense 22 right now in fantasy. And I've always said this. There's a massive difference between good fantasy defenses and good real-life defense. You can be both. Minnesota's both. Denver's both. The Steelers are both. The Bills are both. But Kansas City is, like, one of the rare circumstances where you've got a really good real-life defense here, not a great fantasy defense. Honestly, I'd put Tennessee in that category too. Tennessee's defense is actually really tough. It's just that they're on the field a lot more than Kansas City, and they don't take away the ball a ton. Well, that's what Kansas City does a lot. The Giants' defense, much better in real life than they are in fantasy as well. So Kansas City, I don't think that they're going to come out and, like, produce a massive performance. Like, honestly, you might get more ceiling from Tampa or Miami. I think that's very possible. So I'm leaning Tampa because they've just got a more defensive culture. And if I'm not mistaken, Tampa has had, like, a couple of explosion games. Yes, like New Orleans, they had an explosion game, and versus Philly, they had an explosion game earlier in the year as well. So they've been more capable of explosion games than Miami, because Miami is, like, their best games this year have been, like, 10 fantasy points, which isn't bad. Like, that's good, but, like, they're not getting you any explosion plays like Tampa's defense has been able to. And both their matches up are really good. So I would personally drop Kansas City's defense for Tampa. Yeah, that's what I would do personally. Appreciate the super chat. Riley Penny, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Herbert or Kyler? Also, which kicker to look out for? Herbert or Kyler? I'm personally going to go ahead and play Kyler this week. Kyler and Herbert are close. Kyler is obviously someone that I love to play most of the time. I will say that Seattle is the only reason I hesitate is because I see rain in the forecast. You know, it's in Seattle. So, like, Seattle would never freaking... it's never sunny outside. So, they could very well get rainstorms in this game. And with Herbert, the only problem I have with him is that, I said this earlier, I do think there's a potential chance that this game does turn into a slugfest. I'm leaning towards it's going to be high scoring, but there is a potential chance it turns into a slugfest because it is the Harbaugh Bowl. I mean, that's it. Those two brothers, they want to beat each other, and they want to beat each other through physicality because that's what they both are. They're both physical coaches. They like physical teams. So, yeah, I personally think that it's just a better idea to play Kyler this week. I think his upside is probably just a little bit higher. And I think I wouldn't say his upside. I think their upside is really close. I think his floor is a little bit higher. Which kicker to look out for? Well, kicker rankings tomorrow, as always on Thursdays. I will say this. Austin Seibert is supposed to return for the Commanders. That's what I will say. So, if he did get dropped to waivers, check your waiver wire. Austin Seibert is immediately a top 3 kicker again when he comes back. That's what I will say about that. Stay tuned for kicker rankings tomorrow. Appreciate the super chat. All right, we'll go back up towards the top. We'll see what's getting frequently asked. Super chats get your question answered immediately. But until then, we'll just go from top to bottom a little bit. America First, what's going on, man? Would you start DeVito? Oh, man. Not unless I'm in a super flex league. Or unless I'm in like a 20-team format. Even then, I don't think I'd start him. Oh, my gosh. Like, I can't imagine it. I mean, theoretically, like, his matchup's not bad. But Tommy DeVito, like, let's just pull up what he did last year. Just for giggles. Just for giggles. Tommy Cutlets last year. His first game was 14.5 fantasy points. He actually had some decent games. No, he did. Yeah, he actually had some decent games. I'll give it to him. Tommy Cutlets has some decent games. Yeah, but in reality though, like I can't see myself playing Tommy unless I'm facing down the barrel of like Caleb Williams. To be honest with you, like Caleb Williams is in that class, Derek Carr is in that class, Drake May probably in that class, Gardner Minshew definitely in that class, and Will Levis is definitely in that class. That's what I would say is like, other than that, I would not start. I would not start Tommy Cutlets. Alexis Bolanos, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Tua or Kyler? Ooh, I got asked this question earlier, actually. So again, Tua was on my must-start video today. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. Tua this week is taking on the Patriots. Great matchup for quarterbacks here. New England's not good against quarterbacks. It's also in Miami. It's a bright game. It's going to be nice weather. Tua is great in good weather. And also, I think that the other reality is that it affected this one because I love that their offense, for Tua's fantasy upside purposes, is less run positive. It's going to put the ball in Tua's hands more. And this matchup is good for it. So, Kyler, again, the matchup versus Seattle, it's not that scares me. What scares me, divisional game does make me a little nervous, but ultimately what scares me with Kyler this week is that the weather looks bad in Seattle. It doesn't look like good weather. So, Kyler Murray, I just have a little bit more of a doubt with this week. I'm playing Tua personally. I think Tua, the matchup is just so good. And it's in perfect home field advantage for Miami, and I think they're about to go on the run here. I think Miami might go on a little bit of a run. Miami, let's look at their schedule. Versus New England at Green Bay, the Jets, Houston, next 4 games. So 2 of those are at home. Very good matchups. We'll see. Probably won't be Green Bay, but like you may be able to start Tua a couple weeks. You know, Tua hasn't been great in fantasy this year, but I do think this matchup is pretty awesome. Appreciate the super chat. All right, we'll go back to the top. K, trade away Pickens for James Cook. PPR, I got our Jamar, Josh Jacobs, Chase Brown, Najee Pickens, Lad Marv. Trade away Pickens for Cook. Yeah, I would personally do it. Cook is just a better fantasy player more consistently. Pickens has been good, no question. Like it was the right move to move on to Russell Wilson, as opposed to what I said. It was definitely the better move than what I said. But again, like just keep things in a context, right? Pickens is averaging 10.6 fantasy points per game. James Cook, on the other hand, is averaging 15.6. Your running back room will be in pretty good shape if you make this deal. And you're going to have a flex as well. And your wide receivers, I would already say, are very playable on a weekly basis without Pickens. So I think it just upgrades your team more so than just keeping pat with Pickens. The Argonite, what's going on? Appreciate the super chat. Tracy Jones Dobbins bench 1. Thanks. I'd bench Aaron Jones. Yeah. The Bears matchup maybe not as hard as people think it is, but I ultimately just am worried about Aaron Jones right now. Like he just doesn't look fully healthy. He doesn't. And Aaron Jones is dependent on big plays. And 3 of the last 4 games, he's been inefficient. Since week 8, 3.1 yards per carry, 3, 5.2, and 2.6. He hasn't found the end zone since then. There's a reason that's trending that way. He's not healthy. Honestly, I don't know if he's been healthy since he returned from that hip injury. Now it's a totally different beast. He left on a cart in week 10, came back out there. Now he's dealing with a rib injury. So it's he just doesn't look the same right now. Tracy's got a great matchup versus Tampa Bay. Dobbins is not the best matchup again. I think with JK, I'm kind of counting on him to have a decent receiving game. I think he will. Yeah. I'd go with JK. He's more healthy right now. His offensive line is better, and Jones is just not healthy. He's not healthy. Appreciate the super chat. All right, back up to the top. Eric, is it crazy to start both Brian Robinson Jr. and Eckler? My other option is Ramondre on this bye week. No, I'd play B-Rob and Ramondre for sure, yeah. I think it's not crazy. It's all dependent, right? It all depends on what you've got. To me personally, it would be crazy to play Robinson and Eckler if you had if you were discussing, it would be crazy to talk about that if you had Chuba. I would play Chuba, but in your situation, I think that I'd still play Ramondre. I'd play Ramondre over Eckler. B-Rob, I think, is a great play this week, and I think that Eckler could be fine, but ultimately, his ceiling just goes down with B-Rob there. And Ramondre's matchup versus Miami is not bad. He can hit big games. I get flack for it sometimes ranking him low because people are like, give some respect. It's like, guys, I don't dislike the player, but, he's hot and cold because this offense is not that good. So, yeah, I think it makes more sense to play Ramondre along with Brian Robinson Jr. We're going to go ahead and end the night there. Appreciate y'all being in here. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, kicker video. Make sure to stay tuned for that. And we'll see you tomorrow. Live streams, videos. See you guys tomorrow. Appreciate y'all for being here tonight.